Hello, and welcome to General Astronomy, Lecture 25, the evolution of a protostar. Now, we're going to jump into things pretty quickly here, and there's two things you definitely need to know before we begin. First of all, you should watch our previous lecture on the formation of a protostar to get an idea of what we're discussing here. Furthermore, we're going to be discussing Hertzsprung-Russell diagrams, HR diagrams, quite a bit in this lecture, and for the next several. So if you've not looked at our lecture, I don't know what number it was several lectures ago on classification schemes and the HR diagram, I very much recommend watching that first, because you'll need to know a little bit about the HR diagram to get into these topics. With that said, let's jump right in. We can summarize the transitions that occur during star birth with a special type of HR diagram. Instead of showing the luminosities and surface temperatures for many different stars, as in a standard HR diagram, this special HR diagram shows part of an evolutionary track for a single star in relation to the standard main sequence. And if you remember, the main sequence is the band of stars from the top left to the bottom right of the HR diagram. Each point along a star's life track represents its surface temperature and luminosity at some point during its lifetime. So you can actually see the life tracks or the evolutionary tracks for multiple different stars here. Each one shows a star of a different mass. So here's a 15 mass stellar evolutionary track, and so on. You'll notice that they are different. So if you have a 0.5 solar mass star, it will follow this track much differently than how a star of 15 solar masses would progress. So we're going to look at how these evolutionary tracks vary and what causes these variations and so on and so forth. So that's the purpose of this lecture. We're finding out what happens just before we get an actual star. Protostars of different masses do go through similar stages as they approach the main sequence, but as we just mentioned, they do progress at different rates. You'll see that lower mass stars take a very long time to form, upwards of 150 million years, whereas high mass stars take only maybe 60,000 years to form. So they do occur at different rates. The length of time from the formation of a protostar to the birth of a main sequence star depends on the star's mass, as I've mentioned. So what we're going to do is break this into basically three parts. We're going to look at stars like our sun, so a 1 solar mass star, and then we're going to look at low mass stars and high mass stars and see how each one evolves. For a 1 solar mass protostar, the protostar forms with a collapsing cloud fragment. At first it is concealed by a shroud of dusty molecular gas, which is later cleared away by winds and jets, as we've discussed in our past lecture. During this stage, energy moves within the protostar to the surface primarily through convection. This stage, stage 1 in the figure, ends when the surface temperature reaches about 3000 degrees Kelvin, placing it on the right side of the HR diagram. The combination of this temperature and a large surface area gives it a luminosity anywhere between 10 and about 100 solar luminosities. So you'll see that we start way off to the right and below the main HR diagram, which you see here. So it starts out as just a collection of gas and dust, so it's very cool in the beginning. But as it starts to collapse, it heats up. So as a result, we start moving to the left. However, as it's heating up and the protosun in the center is starting to be revealed, it gets more luminous, in other words, brighter, as energy escapes. So not only does it move to the left, but it's moving upward as well. So during this entire phase, you'll see it moving up and left on our HR diagram. The outer layers of the 1 solar mass protostar are relatively cool and quite opaque. Due to frequent scattering or absorption, light does not pass easily through an opaque material. This means that energy released from the shrinking inner layers of in the form of radiation cannot easily reach the protostar's surface. Instead, energy flows outward by the slower and less effective method of convection. The result is that I accidentally hit the key here. The result is that for a contracting 1 solar mass protostar, the surface temperature stays roughly constant, but the luminosity decreases as the radius decreases, and the protostar's evolutionary track starts to move downward. So that's stage 2 here. So it shrinks and heats as it's converting into thermal energy, but it's very slow because the energy doesn't move outward very much due to convection. So we see it decreasing in size, so its luminosity decreases, but it doesn't warm up too much in the process because of this opaque material. Although its surface temperature changes relatively little, the internal temperature of the shrinking protostar increases. After a time, the interior becomes more ionized, which makes it less opaque. Energy is then conveyed outward by radiation in the interior and by convection in the opaque outer layers. That's what this image at the top right is trying to show. Radiation in the interior, but where it's cool, only convection can really dominate the energy flow. This is what it looks like in the present-day sun. This makes it easier for energy to escape from the protostar, so the luminosity, that is the rate at which energy is emitted from the surface, increases. So it eventually becomes warm enough that it becomes less opaque because of the ionized particles, and because it's less opaque, energy can escape more easily, so its luminosity now starts to increase again. As a result, the evolutionary track for a 1 solar mass protostar in the HR diagram begins to bend upward toward a higher luminosity, and to the left because the temperature is still increasing, caused by this increased energy flow. In time, the 1 solar mass protostar interior temperature reaches a few million degrees Kelvin, enough for thermonuclear reactions to begin converting hydrogen into helium. As we saw previously, these reactions release enormous amounts of energy. Eventually, these reactions provide enough heat and internal pressure to stop the star's gravitational contraction, and hydrostatic equilibrium is finally reached. The protostar's evolutionary track has now led it to the main sequence, and the protostar has become a full-fledged main sequence star. So it's at point 4 when it reaches the main sequence that it's officially deemed a star. In summary, energy transport is initially dominated by convection as the protostar shrinks and dims. Next, the protostar transports more energy through radiation and its surface temperature increases. Finally, temperatures near the protostar center climb high enough to cause thermonuclear reactions and a star is born. Let's look at now what a high mass protostar would look like. More massive protostars evolve a bit differently. If its mass is more than about 4 solar masses, a protostar contracts and heats more rapidly, and hydrogen fusion begins quite early. As a result, the luminosity quickly stabilizes at nearly its final value, with the surface temperature continuing to increase as the star shrinks. Thus, the evolutionary track of massive protostars traverses the HR diagram roughly horizontally, in the direction from right to left, in other words, from low to high surface temperature. You can see this most easily for the 9 and 15 solar mass evolutionary tracks, so these two guys at the top. So basically everything happens way faster. So yes, it goes through the same general processes, but much more rapidly to where it reaches a stable luminosity, and it just follows that path the whole time. Greater mass means greater pressure and temperature in the interior, which means that a massive star has an even larger temperature difference between its core and its outer layers. This difference causes convection deep in the interior of massive stars. So you can see here this schematic showing you convection in the interior. By contrast, a massive star's outer layers are of such low density that energy flows through them more easily by radiation than by convection. Therefore, main sequence stars with masses more than about 4 solar masses have convective interiors but radiative outer layers, which is kind of the opposite of what a star like our sun looks like. And finally, we come to low-mass stars. The internal structure is also different from main sequence stars of very low mass. When such a star forms from a protostar, the interior temperature is never high enough to fully ionize the interior. Thus, the interior remains too opaque for radiation to flow efficiently. So energy flow is dominated by convection throughout the entire volume of the star. So what happens then is energy never really gets out easily, so the process is even slower. It takes about 150 million years versus the sun, which takes about 30 million years. But the general path on the HR diagram is the same. It just takes much longer because it's only releasing energy through convection. Now, I mentioned in the previous lecture that there is a limit to masses of stars. Stars only go up to a certain high mass and only to a certain low mass. So let's take a look at those limits and what the limiting factors might be. The masses of stars span a range from about 0.08 solar masses at the low end to about 150 solar masses at the high end. But why aren't there stars with masses outside of this range? The answer again comes down to the battle between gravity and pressure. Protostars less massive than about 0.08 solar masses can never develop the necessary pressure and temperature to start hydrogen fusion in their cores. Contracting clouds with masses that are too low never become stars because their central temperatures never climb above the 10 million degree Kelvin threshold needed for efficient nuclear fusion. Instead, a type of pressure known as degeneracy pressure halts gravitational contraction before fusion can begin. Because degeneracy pressure halts the contraction of a protostar with a mass less than about 0.08 solar masses before the release of fusion energy can balance the energy radiated from the surface, the result is what we would just consider a failed star that slowly radiates away its internal energy and gradually cools with time. Such objects are called brown dwarfs. Brown dwarfs radiate primarily in the infrared and actually look deep red or magenta in color. Brown dwarfs are far dimmer than normal stars and therefore are extremely difficult to detect, even if they are quite nearby. So basically, they're so small that they never get enough internal temperature or pressure to cause fusion, so they never ignite and form a star. There's this new type of pressure that we are learning about called degeneracy pressure. You'll hear a lot more about this when we talk about the deaths of stars. But it's a certain pressure that stops the contraction, so it never gets dense enough to start fusion. So you get a failed star known as a brown dwarf. So that's what happens for the low end. But what happens to the highest mass stars? Well, the maximum mass a star can have is not as well defined as a minimum mass, but observations suggest a maximum mass of around 150 solar masses. The reason stars have a maximum mass is yet another form of pressure called radiation pressure, which gets its name from the fact that it's caused by light. Photons of light exert a slight amount of pressure when they strike matter. In massive stars, some of which are millions of times more luminous than the sun, nuclear fusion generates so much energy that the radiation bouncing around inside the star exerts a strong outward pressure. Theoretical models indicate that stars with masses above about 150 solar masses should generate energy so furiously that gravity cannot resist the force of that radiation pressure. So such stars effectively blow away any extra mass by driving out their outer layers into space. So they're so energetic that they just effectively blast all the material out into space, and then they never form a star as a result. In a newly formed star cluster, stars with low masses must greatly outnumber stars with high masses. For every star with a mass between 10 and 150 solar masses, there are typically 10 stars with masses between 2 and 10 solar masses, 50 stars with masses between 0.5 and 2, and a few hundred stars with masses below 0.5 solar masses. So again, for every one star over 10 solar masses, there's 200 between 0.08 and 0.5, and in total, nearly 300 of mass less than 10 solar masses. So the point is, there's a lot more small and low mass stars than there are large stars. Well, all stars are born from giant clouds of gas. Because a single interstellar cloud can contain enough material to form many stars, stars tend to form in groups. In our snapshot of the heavens, many stars still congregate in the groups in which they formed. These groups are what we call star clusters, and they are extremely useful to astronomers for two key reasons. First, all the stars in a cluster lie at about the same distance from Earth. And two, all the stars in a cluster formed at about the same time, within a few million years of one another. As a cluster ages, intense radiation transforms the dark nebula, producing a reddish H2/emission nebula. So that's just kind of what this image here is showing. So you have these big pillar towers where stars are forming, but around it is the H2 or emission nebula that you see because of that red characteristic color. So because there's this giant cloud of material, we can usually form multiple stars from it, and so we get star clusters. All the stars in a cluster may begin to form nearly simultaneously, but they do not all become main sequence stars at the same time, because if you remember, just from our evolutionary track discussion, they become stars at varying timescales. High-mass stars, as you saw, evolve more rapidly than low-mass stars. The more massive the protostar, the sooner it develops the central pressure and temperature needed for steady hydrogen fusion to begin, thus joining the main sequence. Upon reaching the main sequence, high-mass protostars become hot, ultraluminous stars of type O and B. These types of stars have ultraviolet radiation that ionizes the surrounding interstellar medium to produce that H2 region, giving off that reddish glow. A few 100,000 years ago, this region of space would have had far less dramatic appearances. It was then a dark nebula, with protostars just beginning to form. Over the intervening millennia, mass ejection from these evolving protostars swept away the obscuring dust. The exposed young, hot stars heated the relatively thin remnants of the original dark nebula and created that H2 region that we see today. When the most massive protostars to form out of a dark nebula have reached the main sequence, other low-mass protostars are still evolving nearby within their dusty cocoons. The evolution of these low-mass stars can be disturbed by their more massive neighbors. As an example, the figure is a close-up of part of the Eagle Nebula. Within these opaque pillars of cold gas and dust, protostars are still forming. At the same time, however, the pillars are being eroded by intense ultraviolet light from hot massive stars that have already shed their cocoons. As each pillar evaporates, the embryonic stars within have their surrounding material stripped away prematurely, limiting the total mass that these stars can accrete. Star clusters tell us more about how high-mass and low-mass stars evolve. This image here shows the young star cluster NGC 2264 and its associated emission nebula. Astronomers have measured each star's apparent brightness and color ratio. Knowing the distance to the cluster, they have deduced the luminosities and surface temperatures of these stars. So let's take a look at this. This figure shows all the stars from the previous figure on an HR diagram. Note that the hottest and most massive stars, with surface temperatures of about 200,000 degrees Kelvin, are on the main sequence. So the main sequence is shown by this pink line. Notice that all of the high mass stars are on the main sequence. These are, and then stars cooler than about 10,000 degrees Kelvin, so anywhere basically white, yellow, red, and orange, any of those stars have not quite arrived on the main sequence. Some of them are there, but look at how many are not yet there. They haven't come down onto the main sequence yet. These are less massive stars in their final stages of pre-main sequence contraction and are just now beginning to ignite thermonuclear reactions at their centers. To find the age of these stars, we can compare this figure with the theoretical calculations of protostar evolution. It turns out that this particular cluster is probably about 2 million years old, and we'll discuss how we can age these things soon. So, if you recall, high-mass stars get onto the main sequence quicker, so that's why you see all of the high-mass stars here on the main sequence. But the lower mass stars that take a very long time to become a star have not quite all made it down onto that main sequence yet because it takes a long time. So this image here is actually proof of that idea, that higher mass stars form more quickly than low mass stars. This image here shows another young star cluster called the Pleiades. The photograph shows gas that must have once formed an H2 region around this cluster and has dissipated into interstellar space, leaving only traces of dusty material that forms the reflection nebula, the blue color, around the cluster of stars. This implies that the Pleiades must be older than the other one that we just looked at, NGC 2264. right? So just because of the color, we know this must be older. You have this pink color because there are hot, young, luminous stars nearby, giving off ultraviolet radiation and ionizing the gas, causing them to glow in this pink color. But we don't see that here in this image, because these stars are older. That pink excitation has been long dispersed, and all that's left is just these stars reflecting off, having their light reflect off the dust that's left behind, So we already know just by looking at the picture that this is an older star cluster, but let's analyze it. The HR diagram for the Pleiades bears out this idea. In contrast to the HR diagram for NGC 2264, nearly all of the stars in the Pleiades are on the main sequence. Right? So almost all of them are along this pink line, the main sequence. The cluster's age in this case is about 50 million years, which is how long it takes for the least massive stars to finally begin hydrogen fusion in their cores. Now, you might be wondering what's happening here, why these stars are kind of above the main sequence. You'll get into that in our coming lectures on the lives and deaths of stars. Eventually, stars leave the main sequence once they're done burning hydrogen into helium in their core, and then they go off of the main sequence and become giants or something else. So we'll learn about that later. But just note that all of them have reached the main sequence, and in fact, some of the most massive stars are actually now beginning to leave it again. So we'll get into that later. But just notice, again, that they're all in the main sequence, as compared to the last one. There are two ways to get the ages of star clusters with an HR diagram. What we have seen in the previous slides is for young clusters. The age is estimated by figuring out how long it takes the less massive stars to arrive on the main sequence. In the next lecture, we will estimate the ages of old clusters by determining how long it takes for the most massive stars to leave the main sequence. And that's actually the best way to do it. So we know the age of this one because the least massive stars are just now reaching the main sequence, and so we know how long that's supposed to take. But eventually, stars leave the main sequence. In fact, we call it a peeling off. All these stars eventually peel off of the main sequence, and whenever we see that peeling off, we can determine the age of the cluster pretty accurately. So we'll get into that again in our next lecture. So really, all that really remains in this lecture is to ask where stars do give birth. So we now know that they form in clouds that condense, typically in dark nebula or Bach globules. But where do you find those? I mean, where in our galaxy do you find star formation? Well, we can begin to answer that a little bit here. We have seen that star formation takes place within dark nebula. But where within our own galaxy are the dark nebula found? Does star formation take place everywhere within the Milky Way or only in certain locations? The answers to such questions can enhance our understanding of star formation and of the nature of our home galaxy. In mapping the galaxy, astronomers have discovered huge clouds, which we now call giant molecular clouds, that must contain enormous amounts of hydrogen. The figure here on the right is a map of radio emissions in the constellation Orion. Note the extensive areas of the sky covered by giant molecular clouds. You can see that by this color diagram. So all these colors you see indicate a giant molecular cloud, where the brighter colors is where it's most dense. By comparing the radio map with the star chart overlay, you can see that the areas where the giant molecular clouds are densest are also the site of star formation. Again, the Horsehead Nebula and the Orion Nebula are two star-forming regions, and notice that they are located right by the densest parts of this giant molecular cloud. So, therefore, giant molecular clouds tend to be associated with the formation of stars. Particularly dense regions within these clouds form the dark nebula within which the stars are born. By mapping out giant molecular clouds, astronomers can find the locations in our galaxy where these star-forming regions occur. These investigations reveal that molecular clouds clearly outline our galaxy's spiral arms. So you can see this is a general spiral galaxy, and it turns out that the giant molecular clouds are pretty much aligned or strung along the arms of these spirals. These clouds can have masses in the range of 10 to the 5 to 10 to the 6 solar masses, and diameters, that's by the way, that's up to about 1 million solar masses. and diameters that range from about 50 to 300 light years. This density is several thousand times greater than the average density of matter in the disk of our Milky Way galaxy. Astronomers now estimate that our galaxy contains about 5,000 of these enormous clouds. These clouds lie roughly 1,000 parsecs or 3,000 light years apart and are again strung along the spiral arms like beads on a string. So that's what this schematic is trying to show. Here's our center of our galaxy. Here the pink lines are the arms. So you can see most of these clouds, given by the blue bubbles, lie along these spiral arms. This arrangement resembles the spacing of H2 regions along the spiral arms and of other spiral galaxies, such as the galaxy shown. The presence of both molecular clouds and H2 regions shows that spiral arms are the sites of ongoing star formation. So notice along the arms you see little patches of dense regions, the darker regions, and pink. Well, remember, pink regions are the H2 or emission nebulas, and those are regions around young, hot O and B type stars. So star formation is occurring in the arms of a spiral galaxy. So we know that a cloud must collapse in order to form these stars. So how is that triggered? So it doesn't just randomly start to collapse. Typically something has to happen to the cloud. Spiral arms are locations where matter tends to pile up temporarily as it orbits the center of the galaxy. You can think of matter in a spiral arm as analogous to a freeway traffic jam. Just as cars are squeezed close together when they enter a traffic jam, giant molecular clouds are compressed when it passes through the spiral arm. When this happens, vigorous star formation begins in the cloud's densest regions. Once star formation has begun and H2 regions are formed, the massive O and B type stars at the core of the H2 region induces star formation in the rest of the giant molecular cloud. Ultraviolet radiation and vigorous stellar winds from these O and B type stars carve out a cavity in the cloud, and the reddish H2 region, powered by the stars, expands into it. These winds travel faster than the speed of sound in the gas, hence they are supersonic. Just as an airplane creates a shock wave, or that is like a sonic boom, if it flies faster than the sound waves in our atmosphere, a shock wave forms where this expanding H2 region pushes at supersonic speed into the rest of the giant molecular cloud. This shock wave compresses the gas through which it passes and stimulates more star birth. So here is an example of that. You can see this expanding H2 region. So the point is, you have these really hot young stars. They're carving out a cavity at supersonic speeds, and as a result, that collapses these clouds a little bit, and that is our trigger for star formation. Stellar winds and ultraviolet radiation from young O and B type stars produce a shock wave that compresses gas farther into the giant molecular cloud. This stimulates star formation, producing more O and B type stars, which then stimulate still more star formation, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, old stars are left behind. This figure here only illustrates new star formation in the rightward direction, but it's most likely something that occurs in all directions. So you start out with a young cluster of stars, so maybe this forms first out of the cloud, but it's expanding this region of ionized material. So they give off lots of energy, and it's basically happening at supersonic speeds, so it sends out this shock wave. Well, this shock wave compresses the material next to it. Well, that compression triggers star birth. So now a new region of stars is forming. You have the old cluster left behind, and now this new cluster is creating its own shock wave. So that collapses the cloud further ahead. And then this just keeps going on and on and on until basically it propagates through the entire molecular cloud. So the birth of one star can trigger the birth of many others. That's the basic idea here. So let's finish off now by summarizing this entire process. So I'm going to go through this very briefly. You can refer to this if you need. But you start out with just a cold, dark nebula. It begins to condense, typically by a shock wave, either from, as we mentioned, a cloud passing through a spiral arm of a galaxy, other stars nearby triggering a compression, or even something like a supernova explosion compressing the gas. The point is, it condenses and begins to clump and forms the cores for protostars. As the cores condense, their density and temperature both increase. As this happens, it continues to heat up and accrete matter, but it doesn't happen symmetrically, or spherically at least. It creates this flat disk as it begins to spin. As a result, we also get these jets of material called Herbig-Haro objects that blast a lot of the material away. And this tends to clear away the material around this new star. Well, then two things can happen. The ejected mass can induce a shock wave, as we just mentioned, into the surrounding material, which will trigger additional star formation. And in the meantime, we basically set up a situation where we might form a new star system. So it's really a beautiful process, and I hope this gave you at least a little bit of insight into how stars are birthed. What we're going to do now is go from that main sequence where these stars have arrived in our lecture here today to what happens throughout their lifetime. So what happens as they sit on the main sequence and what comes next? So that's what we look at in the next probably 2 lectures before we discuss the deaths of stars and what's left behind. As always, thanks for watching and take care.